Now, what was the wording of the law under which I was charged? I know it by heart. It's Section 3 of the Alberta Act. It's the same as Section 13 federally. There's 14 of these human rights commissions in Canada. They employ about 1,000 people altogether. Their annual budgets, I estimate, to be about $200 million a year. It's an industry. I was employing 15 people for almost 3 years. I was a one-man stimulus package for bureaucrats. Maybe I should publish another cartoon just to get the job growth going again. I don't know. But what was the wording of the law? I mean, there are some word crimes that we acknowledge in Canada. For example, fraud. That's the word crime. Forgery, if you forge someone. Impersonation. Defamation. Copyright law. Trademark law. The Official Secrets Act. There are many kinds of words that we proscribe. Uttering a death threat, for example, is words that we don't allow. Conspiring to commit a murder. These are all word crimes, but the words and the ideas are not the central element of it. Fraud, it's not the word that they're mad at, it's that you're extorting money falsely. Defamation, it's not your words, it's you're falsely destroying someone's reputation. It's not the words or ideas themselves, it's what you're doing with it. And we have very high standards for each of these laws. In defamation, truth is a defense. In the criminal code, uttering death threats, it has to be real and imminent and terrifying. It can't be just a throwaway line. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. There are all these checks and balances. But what was the wording under which I was charged? And I mention this because it's under the exact same wording that Reverend Stephen Boisson was charged, and I'll talk about him in a moment. I published something that was, quote, likely to expose a person to hatred or contempt. Likely to expose a person to hatred or contempt. Let's just unpack that for a moment. Likely to. That's future tense. You didn't do anything, you might in the future. I recommend a great movie by Tom Cruise. It's called Minority Report. It's set in the near future where they have a Department of Future Crime. And the police use psychics to visualize a crime that's about to happen. And just before the criminal commits the crime, they swoop in and arrest him and charge him with a future crime. And if he would say, but I didn't do anything yet, well, we didn't say you did. We said you were going to. And there's no defense against that, is there? Now, the story breaks down. It's actually a bit of a horror flick, but in being charged with likely to expose a person to hatred or contempt is a future crime. Likely to do what? Likely to punch someone in the nose? If I threaten to run across this room and punch you in the nose, I know exactly what the likely to is. It's a real damage. It's assault. It's battery. But what was I charged with? Likely to expose a person to feelings, hatred or contempt. Is there anything in law or politics or religion or sports or comedy or these days even the weather that doesn't elicit feelings of love or hate, respect or contempt, derision? And if you don't sometimes feel hatred, you're not a full person. There are some things that we ought to hate, and we don't want to be governed by hate. We don't want that to be the dominant emotion in our lives, but there are some things you ought to hate. And if you don't, then there's something wrong with you. And if there's a law that says you may not have these feelings, that's not just a word crime or a thought crime, it's a feelings crime. If it were so easy to turn off hate that we could pass a law and be rid of it, we would have passed the Love Each Other Act a long time ago, and we'd be harmonious, but men are not angels. And we have to overcome our hate, but to ban it, ab initio. Sometimes when there's hate, it's because there's an underlying grievance that has to be dealt with. And sometimes, in fact, almost always, the best way to deal with a grievance is to talk it out. I put it to you that there's a correlation between countries that censor feelings, censor angry talk, and the countries where there are violence. Because if you can't vent peacefully, if noisily, well then maybe the steam will exit yourself in another more violent way. And I put it to you that the freest countries in the world are also the safest countries of the world. I was charged with exposing someone to hatred or contempt. And you know, at the Federal Human Rights Commission, where that law was first formed in 1977, not one person in 32 years has ever been acquitted. They have a 100% conviction rate. Even China lets 1 in 1,000 go to show how fair they are. Even Iran lets the odd person go. Even the Soviet Union would have a show trial once in a while where the guy would get off. Not in Canada. We have a 32-year perfect conviction rate. I want to tell you the story about the first guy ever charged with Section 13 federally. The law was practically built to get him, and now we're living with the consequences. His name was John Ross Taylor. He was born in 1910, and he was a Nazi. He was a Canadian-born Nazi. In fact, during the Second World War, he was interned. It wasn't just Japanese who were interned. He was let go after the Second World War, but he hadn't reformed himself. He had in his mind an idea that Canada would still become a fascist country. It's safe to say he was not exactly in sync with his fellow man, but that didn't stop him. He wasn't a very effective communicator. To persuade people, he would photostat his screeds, his nutty tracts, walk up to the top of an office tower and dump hundreds of pamphlets on the street as if passersby would pick it up and be a eureka, have a eureka moment. Yes, we must become a Nazi state. This in Canada in the 1960s, when 1 out of every 2 men on the street were a veteran who had vanquished the Nazis. The man was a nut. He was an eccentric. He was a loser. He was a racist. He was a bigot. But he was completely harmless, perhaps to anyone except for himself. But the authorities wanted to get him, and so they passed this law, and he was the first one charged with it. He was 67 years old, because in 1977, technology had advanced more than the mimeograph, and they had invented answering machines, and so he had set up an answering machine message with a Nazi tone to it, an anti-Semitic tone, and he would literally hand out cards in Toronto. Psst, do you want to hear something anti-Semitic? Call this number. And I don't know who would do that, but one Jewish guy apparently really wanted to hear it, so he dialed it 27 times, and he filed a complaint against John Taylor with the Canadian Human Rights Commission. The first case back in 1977. John Ross Taylor was now 67 years old, a crank who must have sensed that by 1977, we were no closer to fascism, no closer to being the Fourth Reich than ever, but he was still going to do it through his little answering machine message. And he was convicted, and he appealed. And by the time it got all the way to the Supreme Court, he was 80 years old, and he was still hanging on with his cane or his crutches. He was hanging on to his dream of a Fourth Reich, a harmless crank that no one had to listen to, except for his grandkids maybe, and those who he would bother on the street with his cards. And he was sentenced and convicted, and because he wouldn't take down his stupid answering machine, he was found in contempt of court and served 9 months in prison. 9 months. There are convicted rapists in Canada who serve less time than 9 months, but here is a cranky old coot who, just because he had a dumb idea, served 9 months in jail. No one after John Ross Taylor has beat the rap. It has a 100% conviction rate at the federal level. And this law is so vague. It's so vague that you really can't be acquitted. Unlike in defamation, truth is not a defense. Where does truth enter into it? You publish something that is likely to expose a person to hatred or contempt. What's truth got to do with that? If you watch a documentary on the Second World War, you may have feelings of hatred or contempt towards Germans. And thus the documentary filmmaker about the Holocaust himself would breach that law. If you watch films about 9/11, would you not have feelings of hatred or contempt towards radical Islam? Of course you would. Is there anything in life that would elicit those feelings that could not be caught by this law? Truth is not a defense. Intention is not a defense. And when we were going after the losers and the cranks and the nobodies and the neo-Nazis, it was easy to support this law, or at least to ignore it, because who wants to stand up for a Nazi? Who wants to stand up for that kind of a racist? And so for decades, the jurisprudence was laid down like layers of sediment, case law after case law, conviction, conviction, conviction. And you know the golden thread of law, Jerry, it's precedent. It's precedent. Stare decisis, let's stand the decision. And so for 30 years, we convicted the neo-Nazis under this unfair law. But nobody spoke up to turn around Martin Niemöller's phrase. First they went for the neo-Nazis, but I wasn't a neo-Nazi, so I didn't care. And then they went for Reverend Stephen Boisson. And I wasn't a right-wing Christian, so I didn't care. And you know how that ends. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to care.